The morning air in the county of Ashwick smelled of rain that had not yet fallen. Low clouds pressed against the old stone manor called Heavenreach, and the wind pulled at the ivy on its walls. Inside the west wing, a young woman named Vivienne Ashcombe stood by a tall window and watched a servant boy carry a basket across the wet grass. She held a small book in her hand, but she was not reading. She was listening. The house had a sound at this hour, a soft hum of wood settling and clocks ticking, and she had learned every note of it. Vivienne was not the daughter of the house. She was the poor cousin, brought here at the age of 12, when her father died with nothing but debts. She had lived at Heavenreach for 9 years now, and she had learned in the first month that she was not truly a member of the family. She was a shape at the edge of every room. She was a name spoken with a small sigh. She was useful when needed and invisible when not. The barrier between what she was and what she wished to be had been made clear to her before she was old enough to argue. The barrier had a name. It was money, and it was blood, and it was the plain fact that her aunt, Lady Marchmer, had a daughter of her own to marry off. That daughter was named Petra, and Petra was to marry the Duke of Sarra when he came of a mind to choose her. This was known. This was arranged in the soft way that such things were arranged in Ashwick, without contract but with certainty. The Duke owned the estate that touched theirs on the north side. His fields ran down to their stream. His name was Callum Trevanion, and he was a man who did not smile much, and did not speak much, and did not, as far as anyone could tell, feel much, but he was a duke, and his lands were vast, and Petra was to have him. Vivienne knew this the way one knows the weather. She did not want the duke. She did not know him. She had seen him twice, at a distance, at a country gathering where she had stood behind Petra and held her aunt's shawl. He had not looked at her. She had not wished him to. She had made her peace long ago with being the cousin who watched. She read books she was allowed to borrow from the library. She wrote letters to no one and burned them. She helped the housekeeper count linen. She walked in the garden at hours when no one else walked. She had built a small, quiet life inside a house that did not want her, and she had not let herself want more. On this particular morning she had come to the west window, because the west window looked over the low stone balcony that ran along the second floor of the older wing. The balcony was old. It had been old when her grandfather was young. Her aunt had spoken of tearing it down for 2 summers now, and each summer had passed, and the balcony still stood, and no one used it because no one trusted it. It was pretty, though, in the way that broken things sometimes were. Ivy grew through its rails. Small yellow flowers pushed up between its stones. Vivienne liked to look at it because it made her think of things that stayed even when they were not wanted. There was a small figure on the balcony this morning. She saw it, and her hand tightened on the book. A child. A small boy, no more than 3 years old, in a linen gown, standing where no child should have been. She did not know whose child. There were tenants on the far side of the North Wood. There were servants with families in the village. The boy had wandered, somehow, up through the old servants' stair that no one used anymore, and out onto the balcony. He was laughing. He held out his hand to the low stone rail, and the low stone rail was crumbling under the weight of the ivy, and Vivienne saw the stone shift. She did not think. She dropped the book. She ran. The corridor outside her small room was long and dim. She ran along it with her skirts gathered in one hand, her breath loud in her own ears, the wood of the floor cool through her thin slippers. She did not call for help. There was no time to call for help. She knew the servants' stair. She knew every stair in Heavenreach. She had counted them once, in her first winter here, when she had needed to know all the ways in and out of a house that was not hers. She reached the stair and went down it 2 at a time, her hand skimming the rough plaster of the wall, the smell of old wood and damp stone rising around her. The balcony hung on the outside of the wall. To reach it from below one had to go out through the old kitchen door, across the small stone yard, and around to the wall of the west wing. Vivienne went that way. The kitchen door was heavy and cold under her hand. The yard was wet with dew, and her slippers were soaked through in 2 steps. She did not feel it. She looked up. The child was still on the balcony. He was leaning now, both small hands on the rail, laughing at something below. A cat, perhaps. A bird. She could not tell. She only saw the stone rail move again, a small grinding shift, dust falling in a thin pale line from the seam where the rail met the balcony floor. She heard the stone. She heard it the way one hears a door begin to close a room away. A soft, heavy sound that meant more was coming. "Do not move," she said, and her voice was low and firm and it did not shake. "Do not move, little one. Stand very still." The child looked down at her. He had round dark eyes. He had a smudge of jam at the corner of his mouth. He smiled at her because she had spoken to him kindly, and his small hand pressed harder on the rail, and the rail gave. The whole front half of the balcony went in one long, slow breath. It did not fall in a rush. It leaned first, as if it were tired, and then the stone rail parted from the balcony floor, and the balcony floor cracked along the old seam, and the child was pitched forward with his mouth open in a soundless small surprise. Vivienne saw all of this the way one sees a bad dream. Slow, and clear, and impossible to stop. She ran 3 steps forward and threw out both her arms, and the child fell into them. She went down on one knee. The weight of him drove her to the stone of the yard. Her palm scraped the wet stone. Her elbow struck hard. The child landed against her chest with a small, startled cry that turned at once into a wail, healthy and loud and alive. She held him. She held him so hard she could feel his small ribs against her arm and the warm damp of tears on her neck. Above her, the last of the stone rail crashed down onto the yard 3 feet from where she knelt. Dust rose in a pale cloud. It smelled of old mortar and lime and rain, and something under that. The deep, cold smell of a house that had been standing longer than anyone in it. She sat down on the wet stone. She could not stand. Her legs would not hold her. She held the child and she rocked him and she said, over and over, "You are safe. You are safe. You are safe," in the low, firm voice that did not shake, though her hands were shaking now, and her breath was shaking, and she could taste stone dust on her tongue. She did not know that she was being watched. Across the yard, past the low wall that separated Heavenreach's kitchen garden from the road, the Duke of Sarrow sat on a bay horse and did not move. He had ridden up the lane a quarter of an hour before, on his way to make a call he did not wish to make. He had stopped at the wall because his horse had lifted its ears at the sound of a child's laugh. He had heard the stone begin to move. He had seen the woman come running out of the kitchen door, with her hair coming loose from its pin. He had seen everything. He had not called out. He had not moved. He had watched a poor thin cousin in a plain grey gown drop a book she loved and run without thinking, and catch a child that was not hers, and take the fall of him on her own bones. Callum Trevanion had seen many things in his life. He had seen men die in India. He had seen ships burn in the harbour at Portsmouth. He had seen his own father lie in a great bed, and refused to say a kind word to him before he went. He had not, in his 32 years, seen anything quite like the small, quiet woman, sitting on the wet stone of a country manor's yard, holding a child that had almost broken on the ground. Telling him he was safe in a voice that was not shaking, though her whole body was shaking. He watched her a long time. He did not go to her. There was a thing in him that told him she would not want to be seen just now. He turned his horse and rode back down the lane the way he had come. He did not go home. He went to the small church at the crossroads, and he sat on a stone bench in the yard for an hour, and he thought about what he had seen. He was a man who did not act on feelings. He acted on facts. He had been raised by a father who had told him, at 7 years old, that a duke who is ruled by his heart is a duke who loses his lands. He had believed his father then. He mostly believed him still. But he sat on the stone bench, and the wind moved in the yew trees above him, and he heard again in his mind the sound of a woman's voice saying, "You are safe. You are safe. You are safe," and he understood, without wishing to, that a fact had entered him, a fact he would not be able to put down. In the yard at Heavenreach, Vivienne stood at last. Her legs held her, though only just. She carried the child back through the kitchen door and into the warm kitchen, where the cook, a large woman named Mrs. Puddick, cried out at the sight of them and clutched her apron to her mouth. The child, it turned out, belonged to the gardener's sister, who had come to visit that morning and had turned her back for one moment while she spoke to the stable boy. There was a great deal of weeping. There was tea, and bread and butter, and the child was put on his mother's lap and given a spoonful of honey, and forgot the whole thing within an hour, as children do. Vivienne slipped away. She went up the servant's stair to her small room. She closed the door, she sat down on her narrow bed, and she looked at her hand, which was bleeding at the palm from a scrape she had not noticed, and she began at last to cry, very quietly, so that no one in the house would hear. She cried for perhaps 3 minutes. Then she stopped. She washed her hand in the basin. She changed her stockings, which were wet. She went down to the drawing room, because it was nearly 11. And at 11 her aunt would want her to sit and hold the yellow embroidery hoop that no one in the house cared about, and if she was late her aunt would say something small and sharp about the manners of poor cousins. She told no one what had happened. Mrs. Puddick told the gardener's sister to say nothing. The gardener's sister, weeping with gratitude, agreed. The old balcony was declared by the steward to have fallen in the night from the weight of rain. The stones were carted away. By afternoon the wall where it had stood looked plain and blank and as if the balcony had never been. Petra, coming down to dinner, said, "Oh, that ugly balcony is gone at last." Good, and no one spoke of it again. Vivienne bent over her yellow embroidery hoop and pushed the needle through the cloth and did not lift her eyes. But she thought, with a strange steady feeling in her chest, that she had done a thing that day that mattered. It did not matter that no one knew. It mattered because she knew. 3 days passed. The rain came and went. The lanes ran wet, and the fields turned deep green. On the 4th day, Petra came into the small parlour where Vivienne sat mending a torn hem, and Petra was pink in the face with excitement. "He is coming," Petra said. "Mother had a note. The Duke of Sarrow is coming to dine on Thursday. She thinks he means to declare himself at last." Vivienne pushed the needle through the hem. "That is good news," she said. "You will wear the brown gown," Petra said. "The one with the plain sleeves. Mother does not want you in anything that draws the eye." "Of course," Vivienne said. Petra swept out of the room in a smell of rose-water and hot silk. Vivienne finished the hem. She thought about the Duke and she felt nothing in particular. She had made her peace, long ago, with what she could and could not have. He was to be Petra's. Petra was pretty and rich, and Vivienne was neither, and this was how the world had been arranged, and she was not the sort of woman who wasted her strength trying to bend a thing that would not bend. Thursday came. The house was polished until it hurt to look at. There were 3 sorts of soup, and a fish, and a pheasant, and a syllabub the colour of thin cream. Vivienne wore the brown gown. Her hair was pinned in a plain knot at the back of her head. She sat where she was told to sit, 3 places down from the Duke, between Petra's dull cousin from Bath and the vicar's wife, who spoke only of her nerves. She kept her eyes on her plate. She spoke when spoken to. She was, as she had been for 9 years, a shape at the edge of the room. The Duke sat at her aunt's right hand. He was tall and dark and quiet, and he did not smile once through the first course. Vivienne, who did not mean to look at him, looked once, because it was hard not to. His face was strong and still. There was a small scar at the corner of his jaw. His hands, when he lifted his glass, were steady in a way that told her he had been steady for a long time about many things. He did not look at her. She did not expect him to. After the second course, her aunt said, in a voice that was meant to sound casual and did not, "Your Grace, our Petra plays the pianoforte quite finely. Perhaps after dinner she might be persuaded." "That would be pleasant," the Duke said. His voice was low and even. It was a voice that did not lift or fall much. Petra coloured prettily. Vivienne kept her eyes on her plate. "And Miss Ashcombe," the Duke said, and Vivienne did not lift her head at first, because there was no Miss Ashcombe at the table who was likely to be addressed by a Duke, and it took her a full second to remember that she was Miss Ashcombe, and that he had said her name. She lifted her head. The room seemed suddenly very small and very warm. Every face at the long table had turned toward her, and every face was surprised, and her aunt's mouth was open in a small round shape she had never seen before. "Yes, Your Grace," Vivienne said, and her voice was steady, because she had learned long ago how to make her voice steady when she wished to. "I understand you were of some assistance in the yard here on Tuesday last," the Duke said. The room went silent. It went silent the way she had not known a room could go silent. The clatter of the servant behind the sideboard stopped. The tick of the great clock in the hall down the passage was suddenly loud. The vicar's wife, who had been about to speak of her nerves, closed her mouth. Petra's dull cousin from Bath set down his fork. Her aunt's face changed colour, first pink, then white. Every eye in the room was on Vivienne. Vivienne looked at the Duke. She did not know how he knew. She had a strange, steady feeling in her chest, the same feeling she had had in the yard. "I did what anyone would have done, Your Grace," she said. "That is not so," the Duke said. He said it without heat, without any raising of the voice as one states a plain fact. It was the plainness that made the room stay silent. Her aunt drew in a breath as if to speak, and did not. Petra's face was going through a slow set of small changes, none of them pleasant. "May I ask, Your Grace," said her aunt at last, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound only curious, "what event you are referring to?" The Duke did not take his eyes from Vivienne. "The old balcony on the west wing fell on Tuesday morning," he said. "Miss Ashcombe caught the falling child from the collapsing balcony. I saw it from the lane. Unaware, I believe, that I saw everything." He said the words simply. He did not decorate them. He did not linger on them, but they carried, in the quiet room, the weight of a great heavy stone being set down carefully in the exact center of the table. Vivienne did not know what to say. She had thought no one had seen. She had lived 4 days believing no one had seen. She looked at the Duke, and he looked at her, and his eyes were dark and steady, and there was in them a thing she could not read, but which was not pity, and was not amusement, and was not the ordinary look of a great man addressing a poor cousin. "Well," said her aunt at last, in a bright voice that was not bright at all, "how very brave of you, Vivienne. You did not say. You should have said." "I did not think it was of consequence," Vivienne said quietly. "It was of consequence," the Duke said. And he lifted his glass, and he did not drink from it, and he set it down again, and he turned to her aunt and said, in the same level voice, "The child is well, I trust?" "Quite well, Your Grace," her aunt said. "Quite well. The gardener's sister?" "Yes, good," the Duke said. And he took up his knife, and he cut a piece of the pheasant on his plate, and he began, at last, to eat. But the room did not recover. The room held its silence like a held breath for a long moment longer, and then the vicar's wife said something about the weather, and everyone was grateful, and the talk started up again in the wrong places, and Vivienne looked down at her plate, and could not eat. After dinner, Petra played the pianoforte. She played well. She was proud of her playing. The Duke listened with his hands folded and his eyes half closed, and he thanked her when she was done, and he did not ask her to play again. He crossed the drawing room, past the small tables where the older women sat with their cards, and he stopped in front of Vivienne, who had taken her yellow embroidery hoop out of habit, because it was easier than sitting with her hands empty. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. She rose. "Your Grace." "Would you walk in the long gallery a moment?" he said. "There is a portrait there that I understand belonged to your father." It was a lie. There was no such portrait in the long gallery. Her father had been a poor man who had owned 2 coats and a horse, but she understood that the lie was for the room, and not for her. She said, "Yes, Your Grace," and she set down the embroidery hoop, and she walked with him out of the drawing-room, and every eye in the drawing-room went with them. The long gallery was cool and shadowed. A single row of candles burned at the far end. The floor was old oak, and it creaked under their steps in the same 3 places it always creaked. The air here smelled of beeswax and dry roses from the bowl on the sideboard, and under that, faintly, of the old stone of the walls. The Duke walked slowly. He was matching his step to hers. She noticed this, and she did not know what to do with it. He stopped near the middle of the gallery, where the light was low. He did not pretend to look at a portrait. "I frightened you at dinner," he said. "I did not intend to. I have thought about it 4 days. I could not think of a way to say it that would not carry weight. So I gave up on saying it lightly." "You did not frighten me," she said. She said it because it was true. He had surprised her. He had not frightened her. She was not a woman who was easily frightened. She had been frightened only once in the last 4 days, and that had been in the yard, and it had been for a child, not for herself. "I was in the lane," he said. "I heard the stone begin to move. I saw you come out of the kitchen door. I saw you drop your book. It was not much of a book," she said. Something crossed his face that might have been a smile. It was gone before she could be sure. "You did not know I was there," he said. "That is why I could not stop looking." She did not know what to say to that. She looked down at her hands. There was a small mark on her palm where the scrape was healing. She curled her fingers over it. "I came here tonight," he said, "because it was expected that I would. I came here believing I would say a certain thing to your aunt before the evening ended. I no longer intend to say it." She lifted her eyes. "I do not know what I intend," he said. "I know only that I could not sit at that table and eat a pheasant while pretending I had not seen what I saw. I have been called a cold man by many people, Miss Ashcombe, and most of them are right. But I am not so cold as that. Your Grace," she began. "Callum," he said, "in this gallery. Only for a moment, and only if you wish." She did not say his name. It was too great a thing to say his name. But she did not look away. That was as much as she could give him just then, and he seemed to understand it. "I do not know what happens next," he said. "I make no promise. I owe things to my name and my house. I owe things I did not choose. But I will not marry a woman I have not chosen. Not now. Not after Tuesday." She thought about Petra, in the drawing room playing the pianoforte. She thought about her aunt's face at the dinner table. "You will make an enemy of this house, Your Grace," she said. "Yes," he said. "You will make an enemy of my aunt." "Yes, that will fall on me," she said, "after you have gone home." He was silent a long moment. In that silence she heard the clock in the hall, and the faint sound of Petra playing again in the drawing room, and, further off, a dog barking somewhere at the stable. "I know it," he said at last. "That is why I will not leave you here alone." She looked at him, and she did not know what he meant, and she was afraid to guess. "I mean," he said, and he chose his words slowly, "that I will not act tonight in a way that I cannot follow through on tomorrow. I will act carefully. I will act correctly. But I will act. You will not be left to bear this alone. I give you my word." "Your word," she said quietly. "It is not much yet," he said. "In time I hope it will be more." She held his eyes then, and neither of them looked away. The candle at the far end of the gallery guttered and steadied. A moth turned once around the flame and away. Somewhere in the house a door opened and closed. Vivienne felt her breath in her throat, and the pulse at her wrist, and the small ache in her scraped palm, and she understood, without being able to name it, that a thing had been said in this dim gallery that could not be unsaid, and that her life had turned a corner in the dark without asking her leave. "I should go back," she said. "Yes," he said, "so should I." They walked back together. At the door of the drawing room he paused, and he said, in his low, level voice, "Thank you for walking with me, Miss Ashcombe." He said it loudly enough for the room to hear. Then he went in, and he crossed to her aunt, and he thanked her for the dinner with the same steady courtesy, and he left within the hour. When the front door closed behind him, her aunt turned in a slow, careful way, and she looked at Vivienne with an expression Vivienne had not seen on her face in 9 years. It was not anger. It was worse than anger. It was the look of a woman who has just understood that a small, quiet piece of furniture in her house has begun, quite without permission, to move on its own. "Vivienne," her aunt said, "go to bed." Vivienne went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the narrow room with the small window, and she listened to the house settle, and she thought about the Duke's voice saying, "I give you my word," and she thought about the balcony, and the child and her aunt's face, and she understood that whatever came next would be hard. She was not afraid of hard things. She had lived 9 years in this house. She knew how to be quiet and how to be steady, and how to do a small thing well when no one was watching. Whatever came next, she would meet it as she had met the falling child, without thinking, with her arms open, taking the weight on her own bones if she had to. She slept at last. She dreamed of stone dust and a small hand pressing hers. In the morning, everything changed. Her aunt did not come to breakfast. Petra came down with red-rimmed eyes and did not speak to Vivienne. The steward, a thin, sour man named Mr. Bracewell, appeared in the doorway of the small parlour at 10 o'clock and told Vivienne that Lady Marchmere wished to see her in the yellow room. Vivienne set aside her book and went. The yellow room was where her aunt received tenants and tradesmen. It was a room meant to remind whoever entered it that they were being received, not welcomed. Lady Marchmere sat at the small writing desk with her back very straight. She did not rise. She did not offer Vivienne a seat. "You will leave this house tomorrow," Lady Marchmere said. Her voice was flat. "You will go to your cousin Hesper in Northumberland. I have written to her. She will take you in. You will not correspond with anyone in this house. You will not, in particular, correspond with any person of rank in this county. Do you understand me?" Vivienne understood. She had understood, in truth, from the moment the front door had closed on the Duke last night. "Yes, Aunt," she said. "You have been ungrateful, Vivienne. 9 years I have kept you. 9 years I have fed and clothed and sheltered you. And in one evening, in one careless evening, you have stepped where you were not asked to step, and you have shamed my daughter in her own house. I did not mean to shame Petra. Aunt, do not use her name. You have not the right." Her aunt's mouth tightened. Then, very deliberately, she said the thing Vivienne would remember the rest of her life. She said, "You were a stain on a linen my mother left me, and I have washed you as best I could, and now I find you cannot be washed out. So I will burn the linen and be rid of you both." Vivienne did not flinch. She stood very still, in the plain grey gown she had put on that morning, and she let the words land. Her aunt watched her face for the flinch that did not come. And something in her aunt's face grew colder, because a woman who does not flinch when struck is a woman who cannot be struck again in the same way. "You may go," Lady Marchmere said. "Yes, Aunt," Vivienne said. She curtsied. She left the yellow room. She walked up the stairs to her small room, and she closed the door, and she stood for a long moment with her back against it. And she pressed her hands flat against the wood, and she breathed in and out, and in and out, until the shaking stopped. She did not weep. There was no time for weeping. She was to leave the next day. She had a small trunk. She had 2 gowns and 3 books, and a locket that had been her mother's. She had a little money that she had saved from the small allowance her aunt gave her, folded in a handkerchief in the bottom of the trunk. She began, quietly and neatly, to pack. She did not think about the Duke. She did not let herself think about the Duke. He had said, "I give you my word," but he was in his own great house now, and Northumberland was very far, and words spoken in candlelight had a way of thinning in the sun. Late in the afternoon, a note came to the servant's door. Mrs. Puddick brought it up herself. It was folded small and sealed with a plain black wax. Mrs. Puddick's eyes were kind and worried. "A boy brought it from the North Road, miss," she said. Vivienne opened it. The paper smelled faintly of the outside, of hoarse and cold air. The writing was small and firm. "They will move you. Do not fear. Wherever they send you, I will find you. I have not spoken lightly. C.T." She read it twice. She folded it. She held it in her hand a long moment, and then she slipped it inside the front of her gown, where it lay against the skin over her heart. She did not know if the promise could be kept. She was going to Northumberland tomorrow. She would go anyway. But she did not, in her narrow room, feel entirely alone. That was a thing she had not expected. She left Heavenreach the next morning in the small closed carriage her aunt had ordered. Petra did not come down. Mrs. Puddick pressed a small package of bread and cheese into her hands at the door and hugged her hard and would not meet her eyes. The gardener's sister came running out of the kitchen and put a small pressed flower into her palm and said, "God keep you, miss. God keep you always." Vivienne climbed into the carriage. The door was shut. The horses moved. She did not look back at the house. The road to Northumberland was long. It took 3 days. She stayed at coaching inns her aunt had arranged, in small back rooms with narrow beds. She spoke little. She read her books. She held the note against her heart, and she did not open it again, because she had it by memory. Her cousin Hesper's house stood on a low hill above a grey sea. Hesper was a widow of 60, thin and pale and kind in a distant, distracted way. She had known Vivienne's mother long ago. She received Vivienne without warmth, but without cruelty. She showed her a small room at the back of the house that looked out over the moor. She said, "You will help me with the household. I have not much company. You will find it very dull." "I like dull, cousin," Vivienne said. Hesper looked at her for the first time with something like interest. "Do you?" she said. "That is a good thing to like. Come down at 6 for tea." Vivienne unpacked her trunk. She placed her books on the small shelf. She put her mother's locket on the table by the bed. She took the Duke's note out of the front of her gown and she opened it at last and read it again. Then she put it inside the front cover of her prayer book, and she went downstairs at 6 for tea. 2 weeks passed. The house on the moor was quiet in a way Havenreach had never been. The wind blew hard against the windows at night. The sea sounded, always in the low background of every room. Vivienne learned Hesper's habits. Hesper woke at 7. Hesper drank strong tea. Hesper read only history, and only history of England, and only history of England before 1600. Hesper walked on the beach at 4 each afternoon, whatever the weather. Vivienne began to walk with her. They did not speak much on these walks. That suited Vivienne. She listened to the sea. She let the cold wind take the smell of the manor at Ashwick out of her hair. She thought sometimes about the child in the yard, and she thought sometimes about the Duke in the gallery, and she made her peace, as best she could, with the knowledge that she might not see him again. She had had one moment. That was more than most poor cousins had. It would have to be enough. On the 15th day, Hesper came into the small parlour, where Vivienne was mending a stocking, and she stood in the doorway a long moment before she spoke. "There is a gentleman at the front door." "Vivienne," Hesper said, in her thin, dry voice. "He says his name is the Duke of Sarrow. He says he has ridden here from Ashwick. His horse is at my gate and it is very tired. Should I let him in?" Vivienne did not stand at once. She could not. Her hands went cold, and then very warm, and she set the stocking down carefully on the arm of the chair, and she folded her hands in her lap so they would not shake. "Yes, cousin," she said. "Please let him in." Hesper looked at her a moment. She said, "I thought perhaps you would say yes." Then she went out. Vivienne stood up. She smoothed the front of her gown. She checked, without meaning to, that her hair was pinned. She heard footsteps in the hall. She heard the low murmur of Hesper's voice, and the low murmur of a voice she had heard in her mind for 2 weeks, and had not been sure she remembered rightly. She had remembered it rightly. He came into the small parlour. His boots were muddy to the knee. His coat was dark with old rain. There was a smell about him of horse and cold wet wool, and faintly, under that, of wood smoke, as if he had stopped at a fire somewhere on the road and let his coat dry only once. His hair was untidy. He had not shaved that day, or perhaps the day before. He looked, in short, like a man who had ridden 3 days without rest to reach a house on a low hill above a grey sea. He stopped inside the door. He did not cross to her. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was steady. She had not known, until she said it, whether it would be. Hesper, behind him, said, "I will bring tea," and she went out. And she closed the door most of the way, but not quite. Vivienne, with a small quick lift of the heart, understood that her cousin Hesper was on her side. She had not known she had a side. She had one now. The Duke did not sit. He stood near the door, and he looked at her, and he said, "You are well. I am well. Your cousin has been kind. She has been just. It is more than I expected." He nodded once. He looked down at his hands, and then at her, and he said, "I told you I would find you." "You did," she said. "I said I would not leave you to bear it alone." "You did." He drew a breath. She saw it lift his shoulders and settle them again. "I have spoken to your aunt," he said. "I rode to Havenreach the morning after that dinner, and I asked to see her, and she received me in the yellow room. She would not tell me where you had been sent. I asked 3 times. She would not say. I left. I went to my own house and I set my steward to finding out. It took him 9 days. I do not blame him. Your aunt covered her tracks well. I rode as soon as I knew." "You should not have," Vivienne said quietly. "You have made an enemy of her. Society will speak." "Society is speaking already," he said. There was, for the first time, something like the beginning of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Petra Marchmere is engaged to a Mr. Lowther of Kent. It was announced last week. She did not, I understand, weep long." Vivienne pressed her lips together. She did not smile. She almost smiled. Mr. Lowther has a very great deal of money, the Duke said. More than I have, I am told, though I doubt it. Your cousin will do well by him. Your aunt will do well by the settlement. I do not think either of them is thinking of you at all just now. That is a mercy, Vivienne said. Yes, he said. It is. He was quiet a moment. Then he crossed the small room at last, slowly, and he stopped a proper distance from her, and he said, May I sit? Please. He sat in the chair opposite hers. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at his hands, and then at her. I have come, he said, to ask you a question. I do not ask it lightly. I ask it because I have thought about it for 3 weeks and I have found no other question worth asking. She waited. Would you consider, he said, in time, becoming my wife? The wind moved in the window. The fire in the small grate cracked softly. Somewhere down the hall Hesper set a tray down on a wooden table, and the small sound of china carried. Vivienne did not answer at once. She had thought, if this moment ever came, that she would know what to say. She did not know. She had lived 9 years in a house that had told her she was nothing. She had been told 3 weeks ago that she was a stain to be burned out of linen. She had caught a falling child, and she had walked in a long gallery in the dark, and she had ridden 3 days in a closed carriage without weeping. She was not the same woman she had been a month ago. She did not yet know who she was becoming. Your Grace, she said, may I speak plainly? I would not have ridden 3 days for anything less. I am poor. I know it. I have no family that will speak for me. My aunt has cast me out. My cousin Hesper is kind, but she is old and she has no rank. I know it. You will lose friends by this. I have lost most of them already, Miss Ashcombe, in the last 3 weeks. The ones I have kept are the ones worth keeping. Say the rest. She drew a long breath. I do not know you, she said. No, he said. You do not. I know that you are a duke. I know that you are quiet. I know that you saw me in a yard and did not turn away. I know that you kept a promise made in a dim gallery to a woman who had nothing to give you. That is all I know. It is a beginning, he said. It is a beginning, she agreed. They were both quiet. She looked at her hands. He looked at his. I will not answer today, she said at last. I did not ask you to answer today. I will stay with my cousin here on the moor. I will walk on the beach in the afternoons. If you would like to write to me, you may. If you would like to visit, when it does not shame you to visit an old widow in Northumberland, you may. I will not be your secret, your Grace, and I will not be your rescue. If in time we come to know one another, and if in time you still wish to ask, I will give you an answer then. He looked at her a long time. His face did not change, but something in his eyes changed. It was not disappointment. It was, she thought, something closer to relief. That is a wise answer, he said. It is wiser than I deserved. It is only fair, she said. May I write? You may write. May I come at Christmas? You may come at Christmas. May I bring a small gift when I come? A small one. Nothing that will embarrass my cousin. Nothing that will embarrass your cousin. He rose. He did not reach for her hand. He seemed to understand that he had not yet earned the right to reach for her hand. He bowed, once, in the small, correct way of a man who has been raised well and has not forgotten it, and he said, Miss Ashcombe. Until Christmas. Until Christmas, Your Grace. He went out. She heard him in the hall, thanking Hesper. She heard the front door open and shut. She heard the sound of a horse being led. She sat quite still by the fire, and she looked at the small stocking on the arm of the chair. And she found that she was smiling, in a small private way, at nothing at all. Hesper came in with the tea tray. She set it down. She looked at Vivienne. You did not accept him, she said. No, cousin. Good, said Hesper. A duke who is worth having is a duke who will wait. Autumn came to the moor. The heather went brown and then grey. The wind grew sharper. Hesper coughed a little in the mornings, and Vivienne began to bring her a shawl before she was asked. The Duke wrote. His letters came each week, sometimes twice a week. They were not love letters. They were the letters of a serious man learning how to speak to a woman he did not yet know. He wrote of his lands and his tenants. He wrote of a young horse that would not take a saddle. He wrote of a book he was reading, a book about the reign of Queen Anne, and he asked her what she thought of it, because Hesper had a copy in her library and it had once belonged to Vivienne's mother, though he did not know that then. Vivienne wrote back. Her letters were shorter than his and, she thought, not so well composed. But she wrote them honestly, and that was what he seemed to want. In November a letter came from Mrs. Puddick, the cook at Heavenreach. It was not a letter Mrs. Puddick had written herself because she could not write. It had been written for her by the vicar's wife, of all people, who had grown less silly since Vivienne left, and who had, in a quiet way, taken Mrs. Puddick's side in the servants' hall. The letter said this: The Duke of Sarrow had come to Heavenreach one afternoon in September, when Lady Marchmere was in Bath for the waters. He had asked to see the gardener's sister. He had spent an hour with her in the kitchen, and he had asked her the name of her child, which was Robin, and he had settled on the child, quietly and without any announcement. A small yearly sum that would carry him to his majority and see him apprenticed to a decent trade. He had asked the gardener's sister not to speak of it. He had asked Mrs. Puddick not to speak of it. He had left. Lady Marchmere did not know. He had not, so far as anyone in the house could tell, mentioned it to any living soul. But I thought, miss, said the letter in the vicar's wife's neat hand, at Mrs. Puddick's dictation, that you should know. For it seems to me that a man who does a good thing in the dark is a different sort of man than a man who does one in the light. And you have been very much on my mind. Yours in service, Adela Puddick. Vivienne read the letter twice. She read it a third time. Then she folded it, and she put it with the Duke's first note inside the front cover of her prayer book, and she went out onto the moor, though it was already growing dark, and she walked with the wind in her face for a long time. When she came back, her cheeks were red with cold, and her eyes were bright, and she sat down at the small desk in the front parlour, and she wrote him a letter that was not short. She did not mention the child, Robin, or Mrs. Puddick, or the gardener's sister. She wrote instead about the moor, and the sea, and the book about Queen Anne, and, at the end, she wrote only, I have been thinking that a man is not, in the end, the sum of what he says, but of what he does when no one is watching. I hope you are well. V. His answer came 4 days later. It was short. It said only, I am well. I think of you. C. Christmas came. He rode north again, alone, without servants, in the plain black coat he had worn to Northumberland the first time. He brought Hesper a book of the history of England before 1600, which he had chosen with some care. He brought Vivienne a small box that held 6 seeds from a rose that had grown in his mother's garden at Sarrow, wrapped in a scrap of yellow silk. He said, I did not know if you liked roses. I remembered that your book had a pressed flower in it. It seemed the sort of thing you might grow. I will grow them, Your Grace, Vivienne said. They walked on the beach on Christmas afternoon. Hesper walked with them for the first half hour, then said her knee ached and turned back. The Duke and Vivienne walked on, slowly, along the wet edge of the sea. The wind was strong. He offered her his arm. She took it. They did not speak for a long while. When at last he spoke, he said, May I ask you a question that is not the question? You may. When you dropped the book, in the yard at Heavenreach, what book was it? She smiled at the sand. It was a book of sermons my aunt made me carry. I did not like it very much. That is good, he said. I would have felt worse if it had been a book you loved. I do not think, Vivienne said carefully, that I was thinking about the book at all. No, he said, I do not think you were. They walked on. The sea was grey. A gull turned over their heads. The salt was strong in the air, and the wet sand was cold through the thin soles of Vivienne's boots, and the Duke's arm under her hand was warm through the wool of his sleeve. She could feel his pulse there, steady and slow. She thought, without meaning to, that she had lived 21 years without knowing what such a small, ordinary thing felt like, the pulse of another person under one's hand. Miss Ashcombe, he said, Your Grace, I do not want to ask the question today. It is Christmas. I do not want an answer that is given because the day was pretty. That is thoughtful. But I want to say this. I am not the same man I was in September. You have made me a better man by writing me letters. I did not know a letter could do that. I did not know a woman could do that. I am not saying it to flatter you. I am saying it because it is true, and I think you would rather have the true thing than the pretty thing." "I would," she said. "When I ask you the question again, I will ask it in the spring. If your answer is no, I will accept it, and I will not ask again. If your answer is yes, I will spend the rest of my life earning it. That is all." "That is enough," she said quietly. They walked back to the house in the last of the light. Hesper had tea on the table. The Duke stayed one night, in the small guest room at the top of the house, and he left in the morning, and Vivienne stood in the doorway and watched him ride down the lane, and she did not this time think that she might never see him again. She knew she would see him again. She had learned, in 3 months, to trust a thing that was slow. Winter went. The snow came and stayed a long time on the moor. Hesper caught a bad cold in February, and Vivienne nursed her through it, sitting up nights with hot broth and cold cloths, and Hesper, in her weakness, spoke of Vivienne's mother for the first time, and told her a story of a summer when they had been girls in Devon, and Vivienne wept quietly into the sheet at the foot of the bed. And Hesper pretended not to see. When Hesper was well again, in March, she was different. She had begun to treat Vivienne not as a poor cousin taken in, but as a daughter. She did not say so. Hesper did not say things. She showed them. The Duke wrote through the winter. He wrote of small things. He wrote of the young horse that had at last taken a saddle. He wrote of his steward's grandson, born in January, and of the christening he had attended. He wrote once, only once, of his father, and only in a single sentence. He wrote, "I have been thinking about my father lately, and about the things he taught me that were wrong, and I find I do not wish to teach them to any child of mine." Vivienne read that sentence twice. She did not know what to say to it, so she said, in her next letter, "I am glad. My mother taught me one thing that was right, and one thing that was wrong. The right thing was to be kind when no one is watching. The wrong thing was to make oneself small so others could be large. I have unlearned the wrong thing, mostly. I hope your children will be taught only the right things." He did not answer at once. When he did, he wrote only, "Our children. If you will let there be any." She read that, and she pressed her hand against her chest, and she went out onto the moor again, and she walked until the sun set, and she came home with her mind made up. Spring came. In early April the heather began to green again. Small white flowers pushed up between the rocks near the beach. Vivienne planted the 6 rose seeds in a sheltered corner of Hesper's garden. In soil she had prepared herself, and she watered them from the kitchen pump, and Hesper watched her from the window with a small dry expression that was almost a smile. He came in the last week of April. He did not send word ahead. He simply appeared, on the same tired bay horse, in the same plain black coat. He was thinner than he had been at Christmas. He looked like a man who had worked hard for 4 months at a thing that mattered. Hesper let him in without a word and went into the kitchen to make tea. He did not sit. Vivienne did not sit either. They stood, in the small front parlour, on either side of the small hearth. The window was open a little. The smell of the moor came in, wet earth and new grass, and, far off, the salt of the sea. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "Your Grace, I have come to ask the question. I know. Will you consider becoming my wife?" She looked at him. She looked at his tired face and his steady eyes and his hands that were pressed flat against his thighs, because he did not know what else to do with them. She thought of the yard at Heavenreach, and the child in her arms, and the sound of the stone falling, and the yellow embroidery hoop she had held to keep her hands from shaking. She thought of the note pressed against her chest in a closed carriage. She thought of the letter about a boy named Robin. She thought of 6 rose seeds in a sheltered corner of a garden by the sea. "Yes," she said, "I will." He did not move at once. He closed his eyes briefly and opened them again. Then he crossed the small parlour in 2 steps, and he took her hand, only her hand, and he lifted it, and he pressed his forehead against her knuckles, and he stood so for a long moment without speaking. She felt his breath on her hand. She felt the roughness of his cheek where he had not shaved that morning. She smelled horse and wet wool, and, faintly under it, the wood smoke of a fire he had stopped at on the road. She did not move. She did not want to move. Time slowed and stretched in the small parlour with the open window, and she felt every heartbeat, hers and his, in the place where his forehead pressed against her hand, and she thought, without words, that this was what her mother had meant by the right thing. This was kindness when no one was watching. This was a man who had ridden 3 days and would ride 3 more, and who kept promises made in dim galleries to poor cousins in grey gowns. This was chosen. This was chosen. This was chosen. He lifted his head. He did not let go of her hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Callum," she said. It was the first time she had said his name. She had waited months to say his name. It came out steady. They were married in the small stone church at the crossroads near Sarrow, in the last week of May, on a morning when the hawthorn was in bloom along the lanes and the air smelled of it for a mile in every direction. Hesper came south for the wedding, in a hired carriage, and she stood as Vivienne's only family, and she wore a grey silk gown that had belonged to her mother, and she did not weep, because Hesper did not weep, but she pressed Vivienne's hand very hard as she gave her away, and Vivienne understood what she meant by it. Lady Marchmere was not invited. Petra was not invited. The vicar's wife was invited and came, and wept openly through the whole service, and embraced Vivienne after in a way that surprised them both. Mrs. Puddick was invited and came, and she brought with her a small honey cake she had baked herself, and she gave it to Vivienne with red eyes, and Vivienne kissed her cheek. The gardener's sister was invited and came, and she brought Robin, who was almost 4 now and who did not remember Vivienne at all, and who sat very still through the service and stared at the candles. Vivienne looked at him once, during the vows, and she thought of the weight of him in her arms in the wet yard, and she pressed her hand against Callum's arm, and Callum, without looking, covered her hand with his. After the wedding they went to Sarrow. The great house was cold at first, in the way great houses are, and Vivienne walked through its rooms slowly, learning them the way she had once learned the stairs of Heavenreach. Callum walked with her. He did not press her. He let the house become hers at her own pace. In the second week she asked, quietly, if she might turn one of the small south rooms into a schoolroom, because she had been thinking about the tenants' children, and about how few of them could read. Callum looked at her a long moment, and then he said, "Yes, yes, of course. I should have thought of it myself. I did not." "You could not have thought of it," Vivienne said. "You did not grow up hungry for a book you were not allowed to touch." He looked at her with something on his face she had not seen before. It was, she thought later, the look of a man who has just understood that he did not marry a rescue. He married a person who was going to change the shape of his house from the inside. A year later, on a warm evening in June, they sat in the small library at Sarrow. The window was open onto the garden. 6 rose bushes, transplanted from a sheltered corner of a house on a low hill above a grey sea, grew now against the south wall of Sarrow's garden, and one of them, the strongest one, had opened its first flower that morning. The smell of it came in through the window, faint and sweet and warm. Vivienne sat in the chair by the window, with a book in her lap she was not reading, and her free hand rested on the small round of her stomach, where a child had begun, 6 months ago, to grow. Callum sat across from her. He had a letter in his hand. He was not reading it either. He was watching her, in the low light, with the still look of a man who has learned to hold a great thing quietly, so as not to spill any of it. "You are smiling," he said. "I was thinking," she said, "about a yard, and a child, and a stone that fell, and about how, if the stone had not fallen, I should never have known you. I should never have known any of this." "I know it," he said. "I have thought of it too. I am glad the stone fell. So am I." She was quiet a moment. The rose smell came in on the small, warm wind. Somewhere in the house, far off, a servant laughed at something a stable boy said, and the sound was the sound of a house that people liked living in. "Callum," she said. "Vivienne, I did not know, when I ran into that yard, that anyone was watching. I did not run for anyone to see. I only ran because a child was falling." "I know it," he said. "That is why I could not look away. That is why I still cannot." She held out her hand to him. He rose, and he crossed the small library, and he took her hand, and he sat on the arm of her chair, and he pressed his hand against the small round of her stomach, and they sat so, together, In the last of the light, while the smell of the first rose from a house by the grey sea came in through the open window. Some barriers, they had learned, do not fall in a single great crash, but stone by stone, day by day, until the wall that was between two people is only a low place they can step across together, hand in hand, when they choose.